Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and welcome back to Goose Junkies. Tonight, for episode 22, we're going to be looking at some ghostly horror, and we decided to pick two stories, one from Goosebumps and one from Haunting Hour. We're going to be facing off from the classic original 62 book series Ghost Beach against a Haunting Hour short story known as The Ghostly Stare. And we're also going to talk about their episode counterparts as well. Tonight, I am joined by two amazing panelists, Micah and BD. Micah, first, I'm starting off with you. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Just had some dinner, just had work. Pretty uneventful day overall, but
Feel you. Feel
I'm
you.
here now.
Great. And how are you doing tonight, BD?
Yo, 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 people and patrons of the night. I am getting ready for this one because it deals with one of my favorite R.L. Stein stories versus one that I've slightly appreciated more. So this is going to be a fun one. I'm out of any ghost jokes because I made some ghost jokes yesterday with comp. So the only other ghost story I can say is the one time that I got chased by some ghosts and then I found out that I was in the wrong part of the South. So get ready for this episode.
Yeah, and we have a lot to say because when we picked Ghost Beach, or initially we wanted to face something off against Ghost Beach because it's summertime and we were all jonesing to kind of talk about it because nobody really talks about it. And one of you, I think it was you, BD, that said, "Hey, we could face it off against Ghostly Stare," or maybe it was Micah. And I kind of remembered the whole connection here is how there's a grave etching element from both stories in it. So we went with that, and I think we have differing opinions on a few things here, but we're kind of all on the similar wavelength at the same time. So this is going to be an interesting episode, I feel. So we have a lot to discuss. We have Ghost Beach up first, and I'm gonna pass it over to one of you if you want to take over Ghost Beach's book and just tell us what it's about and then what you think of it and pass it around.
I guess I could do Ghost Beach's book because I talked about it yesterday. So Ghost Beach's book, you basically open up with the group, Terry and Jerry. They're basically siblings who have some really fun dialogue between each other. They have a lot of quirky hobbies, and they're staying with their distant cousins, these 90-year-old cousins, out by this little beach house. And as they're on the beach, they're basically doing graveyard inscriptions, but the actual opening of this book starts off with a dream sequence. And it's a dream sequence that Jerry had a while ago. It deals with him basically trying to find his sister in the middle of this swirling mist on this dark night in the cemetery. And as he's trying to find her, they basically get attacked by some undead figures. Some green, mossy, decrepit hands start shooting through the graves and trying to grab onto their feet and ankles. They get dragged down, and then the dream sequence ends, and you find out that basically Jerry was having a vision. He was thinking about that dream because he's actually in a cemetery right now doing graveyard inscriptions. And as they're basically kind of introducing the setting and stuff, they get introduced to these three kids who I think is Sam, Louisa, and their little brother Nat, I believe. And these kids basically pull pranks on them. They try scaring them. But there's actually an urban legend involving this whole sort of beach area, which is that there might be a ghost lurking around. And any time that basically Jerry and Terry try to get information out of these kids, they hush their mouths and they leave before they can get any info. And when they go back to their distant cousins and try to ask them for information, they're basically both quiet lipped too, so they can't figure out anything. But as the story continues, they start uncovering some weird stuff. They figure out that the cemetery by this graveyard has all Sadlers, all people with the same last name in them. And they find out that these are our distant ancestors. So they have a familial bloodline tie potentially to some of these paranormal activity areas. And then they find out that there might be a ghost lurking in the nearby cave, and that there are dog carcasses that end up being dug up because dogs are able to sense ghosts. And this ghost is hungry. When it finds a dog, it'll kill it and eat it, so that way it can never be tracked down. And eventually, as the story continues, they find basically an opportunity to go and meet the ghost in the cave, and some information is revealed that potentially there might be more going on in the story, and you might have to look at multiple culprits instead of just one main one. So this book, I talked about it a little bit in our collab video with Comp before. This one I gave a 7.5 out of 10. It's a pretty good book. Some of the things that I like about this book is how creepy and dark it can be. That first chapter with the dream sequence is horrific, man. The idea of these zombie, decrepit green hands reaching out and basically trying to pull these kids down into the grave is horrific. You got some good atmosphere with basically Jerry being in his bed and hears tapping outside his window. He sees the windows basically, or the curtains basically swirling and moving, kind of like emulating ghost movement. You got some body horror stuff involving some ghosts later on in the climax, which reminded me a lot of scenes straight out of the Dead House book. And if you've read the Dead House book, you know some of the body horror involving some characters. So there's some similar scenes in this one. And I think that the ending is pretty creepy for what it is. I mean, the implications of the ending is pretty dark, and I like that for a Goosebumps book. But the main issues I have with the book is the structure and pacing. There's a lot of meandering parts to it. There's a lot of like kind of like bouncing back and forth. If you've read Attack of the Mutant, this is sometimes a little bit more extreme than that. I mean, they go from fishing to back to their cousin's house. They go to the woods, back to their cousin's house. They keep meeting the kids back and forth, and it's frustrating because the more they keep interacting with the kids and interacting with the cousins, you don't get any concrete information or reveals. It's not really until that big climax scene meeting somebody at the cave that you get some concrete lore behind the urban legend. And you got some little stuff in between, like all the different hobbies and stuff that Terry and Jerry do. It just sort of feels like filler. Just feels like Stein trying to be quirky and doesn't really add anything. Although I do like their dialogue between each other and they are pretty entertaining. So about 50% of the book I like. The other 50%, it can be kind of boring. So overall, it gets a pretty good out of me. But let's hear some other people's thoughts. Micah, what do you think about it?
So I thought Ghost Beach was okay. It's kind of mediocre in my opinion. I think there's a lot of good elements to it, like you mentioned before. I think the standout element and moment of the book is easily in the climax with that ghost reveal, and just like how viscerally disturbing that image is, of like how it describes like the skin like peeling off and falling off and like hair falling out in clumps and stuff. Like that visual is insanely disturbing. And it's just kind of one of those things where you read it and you almost like, I don't know, it's one of the, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just really intense for a kid's book, especially, which is kind of what I love when Goosebumps does that sometimes. Like in Dead House, like you give the example, and there's other examples throughout the series of just like these random moments of just horrific imagery and gore. And I just really like when Stein implements that in. I think that there's some decent atmosphere throughout it. I like the whole idea of this ghost coming out from the cave, eating dogs, and just living up as like a hermit in this cave. There's some good mystery back and forth here and there that I do kind of like, even though it does get a little repetitive and kind of boring with like the constant blaming back and forth, which I think is a bigger sin in the episode, but we'll get to that later. But I also think it's just, again, as you mentioned, it is kind of dull and meandering throughout. I'm not a big fan of the characters, but overall, I think it was a pretty solid book. I gave it a 6 out of 10. Like, it's not as bad, I think, as some people say it is, but it wasn't really good either.
All right, that's fair enough. I mean, I used to be way harsher on Ghost Beach myself. I used to think this book was like pretty much mid, but I think since I've read so much Goosebumps at this point, coming back to this book, I guess pretty later on when I'm like pretty much getting near the end of completing the series, I'm getting closer and closer to that. I can appreciate this book a whole lot more than I would have, maybe like 2, 3 years ago. And I think what really sells me on Ghost Beach more than it did it before is that I can appreciate Stein going for a played straight serious tone story and not venturing into comedy. I mean, like he really kept the lane with the story and kept it serious, and it helped develop this gloomy, like something's off, like droopy atmosphere in the book that carries through in an unsettling way. And the way he was able to write some of these haunting sequences, whether we're talking about the dream nightmares or whether we're talking about some things the character thinks he sees, especially involving Harrison Sadler and the way he's described, it's pretty well done and effective, and it's eerie in that classic old school horror kind of way. This is like a throwback Even for back in the day for Goosebumps, Goosebumps was still kind of that zany series, and it was known for being kooky with some love letter homages to stuff like Twilight Zone and Tales from the Crypt here and there. But this feels like gothic horror, a gothic horror story throwback, and I don't know. There's something about it that I can really appreciate that most people don't give it credit for. Yeah, I agree. The characters very stock, very stock for a Goosebumps book, but they're not bad. Jerry and Terry have good sibling dynamics, and possibly if they're written better, they could have been some of the best Goosebumps siblings of all time. Maybe more memorable if they had more to them. Like BD said, and like we said in our review of the Ghost Beach book, there's just too much hopscotch going on in that first half. I call it hopscotch because when you play hopscotch, you're going from this corner to this corner. You're following a corner path, but you're not getting any different direction out of it. You know what I mean? You gotta go to point A back to point B, point A back to point B, but you don't go to point C until about the halfway point of the book, and it feels like it comes across as it's meandering along. It's just hopscotching around, trying to dance around, get into the good stuff so it can pat itself out. It is kind of evident there. It's kind of remedial in some areas. I think the climax is a bit rushed, even given the build up to it. This is a slow burn book, a la something like with the Werewolf of Fever Swamp, which I have to say, if you look at the plot structure or at least the idea of the story, Ghost Beach shares a lot of similarities with Werewolf of Fever Swamp, down to even character archetypes and how they're played up in the story. But the reason why Werewolf of Fever Swamp is more coveted than Ghost Beach, and the reason why that book is way more iconic in people's eyes and why Ghost Beach is forgettable to a lot of people, is for the execution. It isn't that enthralling of a book. But what it does excel at is being creepy. Like I said, you have some very visceral scenes in that back half of the book. It has one of the most love it or hate it twists in all of Goosebumps history. If there's one thing people always remember about Ghost Beach, it's the twist at the end, and it's thought provoking, and its dark implications is something that you can think back onto an event in the book dealing with a dog skeleton, or you can take it like these kids are screwed, in a dark, cannibalistic kind of way. Mild spoiler there, but I personally love it. I love it when Stein, reaches for those dark areas in his mind, even though he always says, Goosebumps is a silly series. He doesn't take, show him Ghost Beach and be like, "Did you take this one, silly?" You know what I mean? Come on, man. You can't lie to everyone. But yeah, I would probably like because it's just scratch that I've been kind of looking for recently. Might have been more fair on it. If I come back to it in a few years, it might score lower. But as of now, I'm fine with giving it like a 4 out of 5 stars or an 8 out of 10. That's my ceiling with it, though. That's like the highest I can give it because of all the problems. But yeah, I enjoyed it way more than I did. Like I said, if I would have read it like maybe a few years ago. So, does anybody else have anything want to add before we go to the episode?
I was just gonna say that with I think another good thing about the Werewolf of Fever Swamp, and even I would argue, even a book like the first Monster Blood is better at this than this book, which is that when it comes to slow burn, it's good to have a linear plot. It's good to have basically the tension rising as the story goes. The Werewolf of Fever Swamp is kind of like the best example of that. It sets up the atmosphere, it sets up the setting, kind of like what this book did, except the mystery unfolds slowly until you get to the big bang. And even in Monster Blood, the first book, it's a slow build until the climax, and then it rushes the ending. But this one, the main crime was just the fact that it keeps bouncing back and forth, bouncing back and forth. If this had a linear structure, honestly, this probably could have been in my top 10 Goosebumps books. I feel like it was more wasted potential than anything. But yeah, I feel like if Stein had more of a structure, this would easily be one of the most legendary books that could have dropped for Goosebumps. So let's get into Spongy's thoughts.
Yeah, let's get into Spongy's thoughts before we move on to the episode.
All right, let's see what Spongy has to say. Open up his thing. All right, so for the Ghost Beach book, this is one of the most invisible books in the original 62, and while I can see why, I think it's at least mildly good. It doesn't do anything hugely wrong, as the main issue is that it doesn't quite stand out. It has a pretty good atmosphere and some decently sympathetic villains. I also find the whole thing of everything being a Sadler to be kind of charming. Well, Harrison's sacrifice adds nice tragedy as well. Jerry and Terry are mostly pretty whatever protagonists, and the villains aren't especially threatening, and I think that adds to my bigger point. It doesn't do enough to fully stand out. Maybe it did at the time, but now when we look back and we can see plenty of books before and after this doing more with similar ideas, such as Dead House and Ghost Camp, I like the twist at least, especially since Stein basically confirmed that they're dead. Context: in the Q&A in the reprint, Stein is asked what Brad and Agatha did with the kids after the story, and he says, "Let's not talk about it. I'm getting ready to eat lunch." So yeah, it's nothing super memorable, but it doesn't really do anything wrong. So I'd call it good. I can see why some tend to go either way on it. I feel it could work I think it could work as a good first book you read from the series at least. That's all I got. That Stein trivia is really cool. I dig that.
I do think that it would be a good first book because you're not going to be thrown into automatically the weird stuff. You're going to be thrown into something like a dead house or maybe a ghost camp or something more inherently dark. But you get to see how well Stein can build atmosphere at least, and that will get you kind of hooked on his writing style. It's a good starter book for that. It's nothing too case specific. It's actually, now that Spongy pointed this out, this is pretty much like an everyday Goosebumps book for almost anybody. You can pretty much recommend this book to anyone. I feel like if you just like horror, Ghost Beach is a good recommendation from Goosebumps to somebody who hasn't read Goosebumps before. So good point, Spongy. All right, so let's get into the episode. Michael, you want to take this over, or do you want me to take over?
You can take it over.
All right, so Ghost Beach's episode, y'all. I'm assuming everybody out there watching is familiar with a certain YouTuber out there um, who essentially a long time ago made a trilogy of videos roasting 3 episodes. My Harry's Adventure, Don't Go to Sleep, in this episode. The YouTuber is John Tron. And ever since John Tron roasted Ghost Beach back in the day, it seems like the community has just dogged the ever loving crap out of this episode, and it's partially deserved. I feel, but it's also unfair. I feel at the same exact time. It's not that bad. You know what I mean? At least to me. And honestly, this is one of those episodes, like Headless Ghost, when we talked about that book and episode way back. I said that episode was a valiant swing to try to fix the book, but I also feel the same here. There is a valiant swing here to fix up, especially the meandering and some convoluted sequence of events the book had that I think was kind of it was done out of order. I feel, and could have been handled better if certain events were tweaked. The episode I think was a good strong start to that, but of course it came with some fumbling the bag moments and definitely has a lot of problems due to getting into the visual and auditory medium that television brings from a book. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But essentially, the episode is just like the book. You got Jerry and Terry. They're on this beach in New England visiting their long distant cousins of old age, Brad and Agatha. They meet these 2 kids instead of 3 kids like the book. They cut Nat, the youngest kid in that trio, out in this episode, and they just kept Sam and Louisa. And Sam and Louisa are some local kids, so they say, and they're also Sadlers and possibly relatives of Jerry and Terry. And they say that the graveyard that they're at is haunted, or I should say, the beach is haunted by the ghost of a guy named Harrison Sadler, and he's said to live in a cave nearby. And you need to be careful on the beach and stay away. The kids are like, yeah, right. You're just pulling our chain, trying to haze us. But the kids seem to be very serious about it. And then as the two go back to their cousin's house and talk to them about maybe the ghost, actually existing and what do they know about these kids, their cousins seem to be nonchalant about it and mildly secretive, but the kids, they just keep going on. They do some exploring on the beach. One day they find a dog skeleton just chilling on the beach. The dog skeleton looks like a prop that you would see selling for $15.99 at Michael's Arts and Crafts for some spooky Halloween decorations that you can put cheaply on your porch. But they find this dog skeleton, and of course, you got to deal with this bad acting from these kids. Good God Almighty! But every time they uncover something in the episode, Sam and Louisa randomly appear at the same freaking time, and they're like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. This is what the ghost does. Harrison Sadler, he kills animals and he eats living things because he needs to feed because he's cold and hungry and all that, and trying to scare the kids essentially." And the kids start to believe more into it, and they look over and they see the cave has a light on inside of it, and they're like, "You know what? We're gonna go do some exploring in the cave." And we don't want Sam and Louisa to find out that we're doing this because we want to see if they're like BSing us essentially. And they go explore the cave and they do come across this person named Harrison Sadler. And Harrison has his own side of the story where he's like, I'm not a ghost. These kids are lying to you. They're actually the ghosts. I'm from England. I came here to research my family's lineage. And I learned very quickly that these kids were ghosts. And I've seen their evil and what they do. You got to believe me on this. And the kids are like, well, I don't know if I can trust you. And they sure as hell can't trust those other kids. So they take matters into their own hands. And this leads to the climax of the story. After they talk with Harrison, unlike the book, this is actually the first time they go exploring the graveyard themselves and they uncover the gravestones of these kids and see that maybe Harrison's telling the truth. And then they also get shown by Sam and Louisa, who happen to be there again, their own headstones, but the headstones have their pictures, their photographs on the headstones. Their photographs. Yeah. And they're like, well, Harrison must be behind this. We got to stop him. We got to trap him inside the cave. And kind of like the book, we get the climax involving the cave. And except what we got in the book now was rendered down to a random lightning storm and a chance of 1 in a billion luck. Yeah. And actually twice. So you think about the odds on that. And then, of course, you get the ending, which is mildly tweaked from the book, where it's more explicit on what certain characters say and their intentions. And that's pretty much the episode. I'll say this up front. I think the episode cleans up the book quite a bit. While it does cut out the nightmare sequence in the beginning, which was really good, while it does cut out some vision scenes that Jerry thinks he sees out his window that are creepy, it pretty much cuts out all the creepy stuff. But the trade-off with that, it cuts out the meandering A to B zigzagging the book had, where it condenses scenes down into one thing, like the whole beach exploration scene looking for I forget what they were doing, but they were in like a beach puddle for like a chapter or two, and then a couple of chapters later they're in the woods and they find a dog skeleton. The showrunners are like, screw this is just too much. We're going to combine those scenes. There you go. Helps the pace out. Another thing they fixed was the sequence of events in the book where the kids, they go to the graveyard and learn about the gravestones before they go meet Harrison. Here they don't know that, and I think that hits better in a more suspenseful way in the episode because they switched the sequence of events to make it more impactful. So that's another win. And I will say the pace is a bit better here, even though, like I said, you kind of sacrifice the good prowess and some of the scary scenes in the book. Plot wise, it's a bit neater. And I will say I do like the direction choice they did it with the ending twist. I like that a little bit better than the book. Actually, the ambiguity's nice in the book, but I kind of like how campy the ending is in the episode. It's just something that I find so charming. Some people might hate it, especially if you're an animal lover. They outright say what they're going to do to something. Let's just say, and while I think it's wrong in the right way. You know what I mean? You don't get to see what happens or anything, but it's just the thought that counts, really. But besides those things, this episode has a lot of problems. It has a lot of problems, y'all. The acting, pretty much all around, pretty much every single character, minus maybe Brad, Agatha, maybe Harrison, and if I wanted to be nice, maybe Jerry. But the other kids, Terry, Sam, and Louisa, good God Almighty, Dee Dee says this. They find people at Salvation Army. They must have found these kids at Make a Wish, because I have no idea how these kids got hired to be an actor. Okay, it is atrocious, and I'm saying this in jokes. I say this in jokes, but some of the worst acting I've seen in the show, some of the worst, some of the worst visual effects I've also seen collectively. The lightning bolt stuff. We can lay into how dumb that is and how it makes the climax come off goofy as hell. But the lightning bolts suck. The ghost effects suck, especially when you see that skull effect. Ironically, another episode we're going to talk about shortly has a similar effect, but it's more modernized. I think that looks way better than what we got here any day. Um, and yeah, it's really rough on that department, but it does try at least to give that beach atmosphere. It does at least try, and I don't feel like people give it enough credit, right? Even though it has its baffling, goofy parts, and it falls apart by the climax. I think the climax is even more sloppier than the book. Personally, it's a nothing burger of a build up. I mean, you feel like you waste your time a little bit, but I personally think it's not good, not bad. Like that to me is like a 3 to 3.4. I give it like a 3.3 out of 5 stars, or like a 6.6. I guess a 6.5 if you want to be like 0.5 increments. But that's my ceiling with it. and I do feel it's overhated a little bit. So I'll pass it over to Micah or BD, whoever wants to take it over. What's your thoughts on the episode?
I guess I can do it. So, while Headless Ghost, I felt that that episode attempt had really, really just bad execution compared to the book. Because as sloppy as the book was, I think that their efforts basically fell flat. I think that the Ghost Beach episode, while it does have bad parts to it, the one thing I can commend about it is that I think it has a better story structure than the book. I think that the story structure in the episode cuts down, like Comp said, on all that back and forth. It cuts out a lot of filler stuff. You got some cringy lines involving the hobbies that these kids do, but you don't actually see them explore the hobbies like you do in the book. In the book, they're chasing wildflowers. In the book, they go out into a tide pool and try to go fishing for starfish or something. Sam and Louisa don't pull really any big sort of, like, they don't do as many pranks as they do in the book. There's only one big prank scene towards the beginning, which is actually played up to be more creepy than anything in the book. In the book, they basically like fake howling noises, and then there's literally a point in the woods where they point behind like Terry and Jerry, and they go, "Look behind you," and the kids go, and they get faked out. None of that is in the episode. They cut all that stuff out. It's way more linear. It's got a better plot. And also, I would say that I like the twist ending more than I thought I would. I think that the twist ending in the episode is probably one of my favorite Goosebumps twists, if I'm being honest. Just that episode version, because I like how dark it is. I like how terrifying it is. I'm an animal lover. I love dogs, but I'm a horror fan above all things, and horror's got no limits. As long as it scares me, I'm okay with that. And it scared me. Listen, the way that they told the kids, get ready for dinner. I'll get to cooking. It's like, whoa, is this what's cooking? Are we about to get, chop suey popping up in here? What's going on? It was creepy, man. I like what they did with that. But the negatives, y'all. So people say that acting evolves over time. Luisa's acting basically sets us back to the time that we were hunting mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. I mean, if you had the chance to save the dinosaurs, if you told the dinosaurs, hey, you either get tanked by this meteor or you have to listen to 39 minutes of Luisa's acting, you would have one of them evolve into the Oppenheimer-saurus, make nukes, and just start bombing each other. It would be kamikaze. It's bad, man. It's bad. Make a wish. Listen, Make a Wish literally told like, yo, we're done with the wishes, man. After they did this, they're like, yo, we're out of business. We're kind of yeah, we got to save our budget for the Avengers. We can't be giving TV shows these type of actors. Louisa's acting is horrible, man. I mean, Jesus. And listen, I know it's a kid. And I know, Abita, you can't roast kids, man. You can't roast. There's adults supervising, man. I'm yelling at the adults who are supervising it. How did you think that this was the good stuff you had to get? No way. And guess what? She had to audition. For all the people who auditioned for Luisa's role and you didn't make the cut, I will personally send you a gift basket. I am so sorry. I wish any one of you got picked instead, bro. So that's Luis's acting. I have to kind of disagree. I think Jerry's acting is worse than Terry's. I mean, Jerry's acting towards the climax where he's like, dogs bark at ghosts. They growl at ghosts. Oh, gee willikers. I'm like, oh my God, Jerry, you're better than this, man. You weren't like this in the book. The one thing I commend about the episode, which is a minor point, is that Jerry's actually the one who's excited to check out the cave because in the book, Terry was the one who wanted to check out the cave, which is weird because she was sort of like the skeptical one. She's like, oh, you don't believe in ghosts, do you? I don't believe in ghosts. She's like Daphne from Pup Named Scooby Doo, where she's like, ghosts don't exist. That's not a thing. And then she's like, you want to go check out the cave full of ghosts? They fixed that. But yeah, man, the acting was bad. And that climax scene, you have a heroic scene in the book, which is rare for Goosebumps. You know, you got one of the characters basically sacrifice their life to try to take out some of the villains, which you don't usually see. And I thought that was pretty good for the character. In the episode, it's just bad acting, and then you just this lightning bolt come out of nowhere. That was God that saved us, man. God said, yo, enough, yo, f this bitch. Hit her with a lightning bolt, bah, and then hit her with it and stopped it, bro. He saved us from Luis's acting. Shout out to the big G upstairs helping us out, man. I'm glad he cut off that scene. That was horrible, man. That's not a way to. They basically ruined all the heroic character development and just turned it into some freak accident. And I'm like, are we watching the Forever game? Like, is this that lightning bolt mechanics from the Forever game? And are you afraid of the dark? Like, well, what's with this special timing, bro? That was weird. So really, honestly, I used to hate this episode as a kid, and after reading the Ghost Beach book, I don't hate it anymore. I would probably give this one a 5.5 out of 10, which means that it's bad, but it's not atrocious bad. It's just like kind of bad, but I think it's more so okay. I like the benefits that they did. I like the plot structure. I like that it's 21 minutes. If they would have made this a two-parter, God forbid, we would have been dealing with the same stuff as the book, but they didn't do that. They cut it down. They condensed it. And I think it is an improvement in the story, just poor acting choices. And yeah, bad visual effects. Those skull effects are no, no. So yeah, 5.5 out of 10.
All right, and Micah, what do you think about the episode?
I'm not a fan of it. I gave this episode like a 4 out of 10. It's one of my least favorite episodes of the show. It's not on the same level as something like Teacher's Pet or Attack of the Mutant for me, but it's still not good. I think that while there are, like you guys mentioned, there's a more condensed and better paced plot structure, and I think the twist ending is better than it is in the book. Everything else about it is just not my cup of tea. As you guys mentioned, the acting is it's some of the worst acting in this whole show. Like, there's just the way there's no emotion with any of these characters. The most monotone deliveries of any Goosebumps actors, all on the same level as Max from Let's Get Invisible's episode. And it's just like, it takes away all of that fear factor because there's just no emotion on their faces. You can just tell, like, they're almost like, I know they're kids, but it just feels like they're phoning in their performances. Like, even when they're like 12 or 13-year-olds, like, I don't know. Brad and Agatha are good. Harrison Sadler is pretty good, but everyone else, the kids, some of the worst kid actors in the show. The visual effects make me cringe every time I see them. Like, there's nothing scary about the skull effect. It's so bad. And it just, like, I almost want to just turn off the episode by that point. Just to, like, I know it's almost over, but like, I still am just like, no, I can't sit through this crap. Like, and like, the only reason I think I gave it a 4 out of 5 instead of a 4 out of 10 instead of lower is just because the JonTron stuff saves it for me in so many ways. Just because I can laugh by just visualizing and hearing all the JonTron jokes during these scenes. And that just elevates it a bit for me. That's like the only reason I ranked it the 4 out of 10 as I did. Yeah, I think it's just overall one of those episodes that's just very forgettable, very bad. That's all I gotta say about it.
You know what? I have a confession to make. When I was watching the episode this time, I was visualizing the JonTron jokes too. He's polluted our minds, man. His video was so iconic that, like, even as I'm watching and I'm in reviewer mode, I just keep hearing him just like, when he cuts away from the scene and it shows him on the couch. I have to get those intrusive thoughts out of my mind as I'm watching.
Oh, it's even worse with My Hairiest Adventure.
Oh yeah, I guess so. Oh, man.
You know, I have to, you know, before we get to Spongy, I have to say to BD's point about he hated this episode as a kid. When I was a kid, I thought Ghost Beach's book was I was not high on it. I used to be really mid on it, and then the episode I used to not like it all. But like I said, I think like if you look at here's the thing, you know, when we were talking about adaptations or just filmmaking in general, there's two ways. You can always judge the product itself, or you can think on you can think on the effort, right? And you can look at the effort, like did they try? You know, was the studio meddling, or did did they do this to themselves? I feel like it's kind of half and half with Ghost Beach's episode. They partly did it to themselves, and I feel like partly it's because of budget, and partly it's they did try. So you have this conglomerate of things. Like I want to like the episode. I really do want to genuinely like the episode, but they just slap you in the face with obvious things that are annoying or just mishandled badly, or they didn't have the budget, so they had to rush through it. And you can tell that it was episodes like Ghost Beach that caused the show to have to like restructure in season 3. And I think that's when, you know, episodes like this started coming out, that you can kind of start to see the show just spiraling a little bit, because they started to realize that we have to stretch the budget thin as we can across all these episodes, and most of them started to suffer tremendously, especially the single length ones. But some of them did get better treatment than others. I'm just saying that Ghost Beach is one of those examples where, you know, you can start to see the ailments of that old show coming through a little bit. And I think that's kind of a sad thing about it. But I do think that, like BD and I brought up, there was some effort there in the writing. I can tell there was some effort there, so I can give it some more credit than I probably would have had given it years ago. So there you go. Let's get into Spongy's thoughts, because I'm curious about what he has to say about this one here.
I'm very curious as well because I have no idea what he thinks about it. So let's see what he's got. All right, so Ghost Beach episode. Let's get this out of the way. Luisa's acting is bad. The others aren't the best, but she makes them look Emmy worthy. Outside of that, it's fine. It's rather faithful, but as a result, doesn't quite let the story breathe, and the atmosphere, while it's decent at times, it is not as strong as in the book. Plus, the music sounds like a monkey banging on a keyboard at times. Otherwise, the highlight is the first scene with Harrison Sadler, as there is some solid atmosphere there, and his acting was easily the best. It's a passable episode writing wise, but those things like the music and acting hold it back. It's a fair episode with a few notable good and bad things. There's worst ones, but there's better too. Spongy, I have never agreed with you more on one of your reviews, and that was amazing.
And I have to agree wholeheartedly with Spongy. I think everything he said was on point. I mean, it just kind of goes to show that, you know, we all kind of recognize that there are some good things about it, but it doesn't outweigh the bad, and they kind of measure evenly, and it balances out into mid territory, or
Yeah.
as Spongy put it.
And like the only thing I gotta bring up too, the like I forgot to bring up on my negatives, but like the editing in this episode is also just like really bad, especially during the scene where they discover the dog skeleton. Like I know JonTron made fun of this for like every like 5 words, they just cut back to that dog skeleton with that stinger sound effect. And it's like so jarring and just like sloppy.
Plus with the ADR, sometimes it reminds me of like if you ever seen The Room, where it's like, oh hi Mark. Some of the ADR in that movie when they're basically timing it reminds me of Ghost Beach.
So maybe, you know, it's easy to say here that we can just move on from this and say that Ghost Beach's book is preferred from all of us. I don't think that's
Yep.
That's any question here. But that leads us to the Haunting Hour short story. Now, the Haunting Hour short story we're talking about came out in 1999 when the Nightmare Hour short story collection released. I think it was Avon Camelot that put it out. And when this book came out, it was in the tail end of Stein's, pushing to that end point of Stein's original run, writing kids horror for almost 10 years at that point. And I remember when this book came out, I saw this at Borders of all places. Like it was like it used to be when in the early 2000s, Borders was like the place at shopping malls, and they had a whole section of hardback kids books like Harry Potter and stuff. And I saw Nightmare Hour next to Harry Potter at one point in time, and I'll never forget it. I thought the cover was scary. I was too afraid to buy it, even though I saw R.L. Stein was on the cover. I was like, I'm gonna wait to read it, and I still have to yet to read it ever in my life. But I've read a few stories for the podcast out of this, and I'm gonna pass it over to y'all. But I was quite impressed with this, and because this is one of BD's favorite short story, or maybe since Micah hasn't talked, maybe he can take it if he wants to. But I was going to offer to BD to talk about the short story if he wanted to. Whoever wants to take it over, tell us about the Ghostly Stare short story.
I'll let Micah take it since he hasn't talked.
Well, actually, that's fine. You can take care of it. I'll talk about the episode.
Okay, all right, that works for me. So the one of the things that I've said for a long time is the Nightmare Hour short story collection, tied with the Haunting Hour, is Stein's magnum opus. I've always said that outside of some Goosebumps work, this is easily like the best books outside of Goosebumps that he's basically produced, especially the Haunting Hour. But the Nightmare Hour's got some strong stuff in there. I liked it even more upon rereading it, and the Ghostly Stare has been a story that I've always absolutely loved because, in my personal opinion, I always like when kids horror takes a darker route. I like when it gets scarier. I like when it pushes the boundaries but doesn't go too far. It finds that sweet spot and makes it really good. And I think that the Ghostly Stare is exactly that. The story is about these two kids, I believe, named Lauren and Mark. Lauren and Mark, they're basically on this school field trip. They're out doing the gravestone inscriptions with their whole class, and it's a winter setting. You got the thin layer of snow across the graveyard. You got the wind blowing, very creepy, very eerie. They say this graveyard dates back to when the Pilgrims were here, which similar setting. And then one of the girls during the field trip, who's kind of like a loud chatterbox kind of girl, basically starts yapping and saying that there's this thing that her grandma taught her about the ghostly stare. The ghostly stare is a gimmick in this story where she basically explains the urban legend that since the eyes are the window to the soul, when you encounter ghosts in the graveyard and they basically try to take over your body or do some atrocious things to you and prey upon you, you can use this as a defense mechanism. This is basically the pepper spray to ghosts. You stare at them, you look at them for a long time without blinking, and because they have no soul, their body basically crumbles because you're looking right through them. So they start basically being defeated by this. And it's said to be a sure way to protect you. Her grandma said that this has been working for long, long generations, and it's basically been like this secret remedy. And of course, Mark and Lauren don't believe it. This girl is always exaggerating. They never really believe what she says. They think that she's just doing it to get attention. And as the basically field trip continues and it ends up getting cut short, when they get back home, Lauren realizes that one of her beloved gloves basically got left behind potentially at the graveyard. And she decides to sneak back there at night. And Mark says, I'm not going to let you go by yourself. I'll tag along with you. And when they get back there, you get some fantastic atmosphere. It is one of the creepiest settings and atmosphere. I know it's just a graveyard at the winter night. It's basic, but the way Stein writes it, with the wind blowing, the whispering, the leaves and everything, he paints it extremely well, and you really do visualize yourself there. And if you've ever been in a cemetery, which I know I'm brown, I'm not supposed to break this rule. I'm supposed to stay out of scary places, but I've been there, and this made me feel like I was back at that graveyard. I mean, it's really creepy and really well done. And then they start encountering some stuff. They start encountering some ghosts. And the thing about this story, these ghosts are on demon timing. Black Air Force is tied very tight because one of the things involving the urban legend was a neighbor's dog who ended up wandering the graveyard. And the legend went that a hand reached out from the grave, grabbed this dog, and pulled it under the dirt to God knows where. And nobody knew what happened to that dog after that. But these ghosts basically start appearing, and they're not your normal ghosts. They are decrepit skeletons. They got eyeless sockets. They got cracked up teeth. They got moldy bones, and they're basically looking for warmth. They're cold. They're wandering spirits out in the winter night, and they want your clothes. And most importantly, they want your skin. They want to enter in your body, they want to possess you, take over your life, and wear your skin, get a new chance at life. And potentially one of the characters may have to utilize that urban legend remedy and see if it actually works. And let's just say it may or may not work. And some of the best body horror that Stein has ever written is in this scene, because you get this visualization that as they look at this ghost of this like old girl who's around the same age as the character, her jaw dislocates and falls off, her hair starts falling out, and it's described that her body starts contorting and snapping and breaking as she slowly gets pile drived and dug deeper and deeper into the ground, basically limbo back into the dirt, which is a really creepy and effective scene. And it seems to all be solved. The two main characters get back to their house. And one of the scariest scenes that I've ever read from Stein, easily one of the scariest climaxes I've ever read, happens, where potentially somebody that was brought back may or may not be the right one, and there might have been some bad stuff that happened off screen. And if you've ever seen Creepshow Father's Day, yeah, some of the practical effects in that movie for that segment, you can kind of get a similar feel involving the villain at the climax. And there's something that involves a light switch being turned off. And let's just say that my bowels got evicted faster than when my landlord kicked me out. That was some scary ass shit, man. I was genuinely impressed by R.L. Stein. And this story, in my opinion, is a 10 out of 10. It's perfect. And that's rare for me to give, because I genuinely feel this is a perfect package of a short story. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It's to the point. It feels on par with some stuff out of like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and some really scary stuff for kids. And yet it has that Stein flair. The characters feel like Stein characters. The scene involving the graveyard reminds me of A Ghost of Slappy, a similar setting to that modern book that he wrote for Goosebumps. So a lot of good stuff in there. And yeah, perfect story in my opinion. So let's hear one of your thoughts.
Yeah, I'll pass it over to Micah because I want to hear Micah's thoughts on the Ghostly Stare short story.
Oh, I love this short story. I haven't read it in a long time because I read Nightmare Hour. I remember reading it, I think back in like elementary school, I want to say. I think they had it either in the elementary school main library or in one of the classroom libraries. And I was kind of flipping through and read that story. And it was always one that I really liked growing up. And reading it now, it still holds up. It's great. Lots of great, scary imagery in it. And like the way it describes the main ghost, I can't remember her name, but like when it describes that and like the front illustration, but like that kind of makes me almost visualize the same kind of illustration that Stephen Gamel did for the Haunted House short story from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. That's kind of like the vibe I got from it, which makes it like even more terrifying just because of how scary and effective that illustration is. And I think just there's a lot of really great stuff. The atmosphere in the cemetery is fantastic. Just that like kind of cold winter atmosphere just really adds to the creep factor of it for me. Just the idea of being like just two people alone out in a cemetery at night is really an eerie idea. And just having these terrifying ghosts basically wanting to take you over and possess you and do God knows what to your physical body is a really terrifying idea. And then of course you get the ending, and that ending is that's such a chilling way to end the short story. And I know I'm going to go a little bit of the spoiler with how it ends, but like just the idea of like just going home thinking of you're going home with like a friend or a sibling or whatever, and then looking up and seeing a rotting corpse like ghost standing in their place instead, and then just having them shut the lights off, and just the idea of standing in the pitch black knowing there's this rotting skeletal ghost next to you about to kill you is so terrifying. And like there's just something so viscerally unnerving about that idea, and it just plays into those classic childhood fears of the dark and even some adult fears of the dark and just what might be lurking in the dark. And it just this it's such a good short story and just really nails everything that it does.
I think you said a lot of fantastic things that I really agree with. This was actually a first time read for me, and what it made me like Ghost Speech almost the book. it reminded me of throwback horror. Like this is just straight up horror, like old school gothic horror, stuff that you would see, H.G. Wells and all the forefathers of horror that spawned, all the people that we know and love today that were born in the 40s and 50s. These old school guys would have wrote something like this in an anthology about ghosts. Maybe not as dark or kid friendly, but you still feel that in this story. It's just cut and dry horror at its finest. There's nothing silly. There's nothing too creative. It's just a straight up ghost story made to scare you, and it does what it needs to do. It reminds me of what makes stories like the double dip horror and Tales that give you goosebumps so effective to me. And it's just it plays on the mind, but it also plays into showing the reader the horror. It's the horror and the psychological bits that come with it. Um, I think this is one of Stein's best written short stories that I've come across personally. Even though it's only 9 pages, um, even though I wish there was more to the characters, possibly even they could have fleshed this out into a full book and expanded the concept a little more, maybe built onto the ideas it had, even though the ideas are fantastic as a short story. Um, I would have loved to see this book have, have an expansion to it and, build on the mythos and build up to this point in a long form as well. But Stein, if you're out there watching House of Shivers, remake Ghostly Stare or rescan it and make it a full book. There you go. Nobody, I don't think anybody would care if you did that. Um, and you do that from time to time anyway in moderns. But I thought the story was fantastic, and I think you all covered everything I wanted to say about it. It is pretty brutal, given the context of what happens. Um, it's not too mean, but it has this mean nature to it, where a kid that really didn't do anything wrong gets a messed up ending. I love books like that. Shout outs to Werewolf Skin. I love books like that because I'm warped and twisted. But it reminds me of this punch that you just don't get anymore out of Stein, and this makes me miss old Stein in a lot of ways. I'll probably give this like a 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10. Y'all said everything I wanted to say. But let's get into Spongy, and then we'll get into the episode where Michael will take over because I want to hear what Spongy has to say about this, and I want to see if he's in unison with us for once. For once, just one time.
Well, speaking in conversation with them before, I'm gonna get ready for what I'm about to see right now. All right, Spongy, let's hear your thoughts about the Ghostly Stare short story. It's fine. It flows decently, has a solid idea, and really good ending, but it doesn't do much to stand out. As the final story at Nightmare Hour, it works. Doesn't give me much to say. It's nothing super deep or creepy, but it works for what it is, even if that means it's basically being a short story version of Attack of the Graveyard Ghouls, lol. It just feels like it's missing something to make it special. Maybe it could chop some stuff early on to do more with the actual ghost. I mean, it doesn't actually do much beyond the creepy threat. Maybe it starts decomposing or something, but as it is, that isn't mentioned, lol. So yeah, it works well enough, just nothing special. It hits better as you're reading it when I think about it, honestly. Well, he won me over with his previous review, and this one was pure cap, but I love you, Spongy.
Well, he might be on the money here because I've noticed since I've only read 3 so far, some of these stories that I've read kind of feel like Series 2000 books. And I don't know if these were maybe his original ideas or maybe he was just like, hey, I like that idea. I'm going to make a little short story version of it or something. I don't know. But like another story we covered recently, The Dead Body, the short story at least felt like Are You Terrified Yet? Just a short story version of it, but not as fleshed out as the book. Um, I can kind of see the parallels to this in Graveyard Ghouls. It's there. But I think this one's way better than the Dead Body personally. And I know Spongy probably likes Dead Body more than this one. But that's just me. I just think this one is just to the point. And trust me, as much as I love Are You Terrified Yet, the Dead Body short story, you don't get the same vibe because you don't have a person like Craig leading the story. I'm sorry, you just don't. So it is what it is.
I also
Um,
think he's also right about Graveyard Ghouls, but just I mean, creepiness is subjective, but I think easily this is one of the creepiest. Like, there's definitely creepiness, tension. It's dark and disturbing, which I think is the one good thing about Haunting Hour and Nightmare Hour. So, if any of you are R.L. Stein fans and you want something darker, like Stephen King's new book, you like it darker, go pick up these two books. I think you'll find something nice in
All right. Great. I think that went great. So let's talk about the episode, Micah. Why don't you just kick us off? What's the Ghostly Stare episode about?
All right. So the Ghostly Stare episode is basically a somewhat loose adaptation of the short story. It has the same basic idea behind it, but it adds some new elements. So basically, this episode follows again Mark and Lauren. Now, in the short story, they're twins, but in the episode, it's very clear that Mark is a lot younger than Lauren is, probably about like 2 or 3 years. And Lauren is really into gravestone etchings, which is something she does as a hobby, unlike in the short story where it's more of a class field trip. And basically, we kind of open to this idea of this cemetery getting uprooted to be replaced by a mall. And Lauren wants to go to the cemetery and just get as many grave etchings as she can, pretty much before they get rid of all the gravestones and get rid of all the bodies and all that stuff. And she kind of is against this whole renovation because she thinks that graveyards should be respected and the dead should just kind of be left to rest in peace. And her and Mark go to this graveyard and she starts doing these etchings, she starts hearing these weird voices saying like, "I'm so cold," just blowing with the wind. And meanwhile, while she's doing this, Mark is kind of walking around exploring the cemetery and ends up falling into a grave. And basically, it's implied, they're kind of shown that Lauren meets up with Mark, they leave the cemetery. But then when you go back, it shows a shot of the grave, and Mark is still laying inside of the grave. So it shows that someone else has come home with Lauren, much like how the short story ends. And there is this like really creepy scene where Mark or whatever this thing posing as Mark is like sneaks into her room in the middle of the night, starts like pulling the covers off of her, and like it's a really effective and creepy scene. And she like basically uncovers, like when she stares into Mark and tries to like talk to him what's going on, this skull flashes into his face, and she kind of realizes that this is not Mark who's following me home. And she basically starts talking to this ghost, and it basically tells her like, "I'm so cold." It's kind of a silly conversation that happens there, but basically he tells her that because Mark fell into his grave, he is now able to take over Mark's body and escape and have a physical form again. And that in order to get Mark back, she has to go back to the cemetery, find Mark in the grave, and get him out before dawn. And so Lauren goes back, and when she's there, she encounters another ghost by the name of Alice Claiborne, who seems very friendly at first. She looks like she's dressed as a nurse, and she eventually she walks around and she's trying to find Mark. And Alice eventually leads her to a grave that turns out to be her own. And it basically turns out, yeah, Alice is not nice. She led Lauren into a trap and tries to get Lauren to fall into the grave. It doesn't work. And there's kind of this whole climax involving there's a bunch of different ghosts trying to get into, I'm going to reword that. A bunch of ghosts who are trying to take over Lauren's body. And basically, and Mark ends up escaping, and the other ghost kind of goes away. And basically, it's kind of shown that Lauren may or may not fall into a grave as they're trying to escape. And there is a kind of dark twist ending involving Lauren, which is a little different from the short story, but I still think is effective and creepy. So this episode is fun, in my opinion. It's one of the more fun episodes of the show. It's not really that scary, aside from a couple creepy moments, like I said, with the scene where Mark is in the bedroom, or the scene where he's like peeking out from behind gravestones while Lauren's searching through the graveyard. It's more of a comedic episode, especially in the climax and kind of how the ghosts are handled. But I think it's handled well in the comedic sense. It just kind of falls flat when you compare it to the short story. There is a new addition that wasn't in the short story about if you fall into a ghost's grave, they will replace you and you're stuck in the grave. And if you don't get out of the grave by dawn, you're stuck in the grave forever, and this ghost is now inhabiting your body for the rest of eternity, I guess. And I think that definitely added some good stakes to the story. And like the one drawback is that it does, compared to the short story, again, it doesn't have a lot of that creepy atmosphere and any of the big scares that the short story has. And it also doesn't even really have what this story is named after. Like the whole staring into the ghost's eyes to kill it part is not at all in the episode. The closest thing you get is that Lauren and Mark do some staring contests throughout the episode, and that kind of plays into the twist ending a bit. But yeah, that's like the main negatives I have with it. I still think it's really well paced, really enjoyable, has some really good atmosphere in the graveyard. And yeah, I think it's a really solid, really fun episode. I gave it an 8 out of 10. I really liked it.
You know, I guess I'll go. I have to agree with you, Mike. I'm very close in points with you on this. I had a fun time watching this episode, and I haven't seen it in years. But what I found in this episode really, tickled me to death this time around. I have yet to find something. Well, I have, but not to something like how this episode kind of plays out that feels like Goosebumps, but in that Goosebumps show way with the music and how it's edited and just the concept and how goofy it could be at times, but how serious it could be. Honestly, this episode could have been in the Goosebumps show back in the day. And if you go to watch this episode, listen to the soundtrack and tell me that the music that you hear does not sound like Jack Lynch's soundtrack from the old show. I'm telling you, for some reason, this episode really works in homaging that old show. I don't know if they did that on purpose. I couldn't tell you, but it's aesthetically pleasing to find stuff like that. That aside, I think the acting in this episode is actually pretty good. Especially for Haunting Hour, which is normally filled with good actors, especially good child actors. That most of them, if not all of them, at least the big name ones, went on to have some adult careers, and they still have some social media and fan base out there because people love their performances and stuff. Um, but the actors here, while they're more unknown, they're pretty well done. The character dynamics are fun with these two siblings, um, and I think the atmosphere is pretty effective for a graveyard story. For Haunting Hour's budget, a lot of people say that Haunting Hour is a mild step up from the Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark budget, but it was still relatively low budget even for its time and its standards of budgetary restrictions and stuff. But they made something here that was creepy despite those things. I think the voice dubbing has to be some of the more better voice dubbing I've seen in kids horror, especially when we're talking about the ghost who takes over as the younger brother. I thought his voice was creepy as hell. I'm not gonna lie. This time around, I was like, man, this guy is creepy. Now, some line dialogue does fail him when he's having some banter with a girl. She's like, I think she says something on the lines of, "What are you, a ghost thing?" And he's like, "What are you, some teenage girl thing?" I'm like, "Oh, come on, are we really doing this silly, corny dialogue now?" Like I said, it does kind of fail it, but I think it builds up in a very quickly paced type of way, and the climax is weirdly fun. And I think what I'm going to remember out of it is how fun the climax can be, especially when more ghosts come into the situation and the banter you hear with them. And it's kind of dark. It's kind of dark because they're trying to lure kids into these graves. And I think the concept alone has some legitimate stakes to it. If you fall into a grave, you have 24 hours or until sunrise is the next day to save yourself, or you're screwed. That adds some real stakes to the story, and I really wish that if this was the idea that they wanted to go with in the short story from the Nightmare Hour, um, that maybe they could have, maybe if there wasn't a hypothetical book out there, they could have kept the tone from the short story and some of the scenes and incorporated it into the ideas they had here. Because I actually think that's a really smart way to make sense of what the ghosts are trying to do in the situation, and having it be that they're being relocated because of a shopping mall. This is a common trope in ghost stories in kids horror. If you haven't seen Casper or Spirited Beginning, if you haven't read even the newest Are You Afraid of the Dark book, The Tale of the Grave Mother, similar concept. There's people trying to demolish these haunted places or places of rest, and these ghosts come out of the woodwork because of this stuff. It happens. It's a common trope. Um, but I think it was done pretty well here. My only negatives with the episode, honestly, I don't think we've mentioned it yet, but some of the effects are hit or miss. But like I said, the ghost effects in this episode are translucent effects, and most of the time in kids horror shows, when they do translucent effects, it is not good or it's mildly dated, even if it's brand new for its time. It just looks immediately dated. But here, this is some of the best translucent effects I've seen personally. Not saying that it's particularly amazing, but they did try a little bit here, so I can commend that. Another negative I have is, we Mike already touched on it, the ghostly stare element. You kind of wonder, why is it called the ghostly stare, and then you see the staring contest, but the whole element from the short story was completely cut out of it, and I thought that would have made it even more creepier if they can do that element there, but it just wasn't there. So it's like, then why is it still called the ghostly stare? Don't know. Um, so that was confusing to me. And I guess one last negative to it, I don't really find the ending to be clever. It's one of those endings that it literally shows you what happens. So it's not even, it's like, it's a fake twist where you see what happens to the person, and then the ending tries to play it up. Oh, it did actually happen. No, we saw it happen. I mean, like, it's inevitable. Like, that this would have happened. You would think it would, and it did. It's not quite a twist, and I'm like, they ended it on the wrong note. I feel, or maybe they could have made this into a part two, like they did retroactively with the dead body. Who knows? But I think where they ended it, just it's not where I would have wanted it to end personally. But honestly, you know what? I'll give the same score Mike did. I'll give it about a 4 out of 5 stars. I think it's one of the better Haunting Hour episodes I've seen, and I definitely like it more than I had from memory. So there's that. Um, let's pass it over to BD, because BD, this is one of your favorite short stories, and you have an episode adaptation. What are your thoughts on it?
So I'm a little bit more harsh with it. I think the main reason that I'm harsh with it is because I have the opposite effect of the Goosebumps story to what I do this Haunting Hour story. With the Goosebumps story, I read the Ghost Beach book and I ended up appreciating the episode more because I saw I was correcting some things or trying to. In this one, you have this goated short story, and then the episode takes a more comedic approach, and it seems lackluster to me at certain parts. I think that this episode would have worked better if it was its own individual episode, not adapting the short story. Like they could have just made it something called like Get Out My Grave or Grave Hopping, and then just make that into its own episode, or like the Graveyard Dance or something like that. Make it into its own thing. I think as a standalone, it works better. But because it is tied to Ghostly Stare, I do have to compare the two. Um, Another reason why I'm a little bit more harsh on it is because there is another episode in the Haunting Hour which I reviewed before and I saw that I think is like a Goosebumps episode, pretty much spot on, and it's pretty similar to the Ghostly Stare because that episode has a female girl lead with a little brother. Kate McNamara's in that one, and here it's the girl who actually plays the love interest in Creature Feature. I don't know if you guys knew that, but that's an older version of her being the love interest in that movie. But that's the Worry Dolls. Worry Dolls is a Haunting Hour episode that feels exactly like Goosebumps, but it's an individual story. It's not adapting anything, no ties, it's its own thing. And I actually gave that one an 8 out of 10. This one I'd give a 7 out of 10. I like some of the decisions they make. And you know what? Honestly, I'll give it a 7.2 because I like what Micah brought up with the idea of you falling into the grave. I think that's a really cool and effective thing that you fall inside of the grave, and when you come out, it's not you. Because when you see Mark basically fall into the grave, and then this other version of Mark comes out with the coat on, and you walk past and you see Mark's body, his corpse laid out in the grave, still there. I was like, okay, that's effective. It's got creepy scenes in there. Again, that scene of this little ghost Mark basically staring at his sister, staring her down in the darkness, that ominous pure black with the hood over, that's creepy. The voice is creepy. the scene where basically she's in the graveyard and then you see the ghost mark basically looking over the tombstone, that's creepy as well. But it takes some more goofier approaches that feel lackluster to me. The dialogue with the first ghost in the house was lackluster because basically he's just trying to crack jokes. Like again, she's like, "Oh, what are you, a ghost thing? Oh, are you a teenage girl thing?" And he's like, "Hey, how about you light a fire in here?" It's like, okay, bro, you ruined the creep factor with this goofy dialogue. Then you go to the graveyard, and instead of the short story where you got these decomposing skeletons, like some creepy practical effects stuff, you get these Scream Team from Disney kind of effects where you got these translucent ghosts. They all look like these eccentric figures. Some of them just look like normal Joes. Some of them look like a little bit more eccentric. Actually, the nurse girl looks almost identical to the girl from Scream Team. The ghost woman that was running the place, they actually look pretty similar to each other, which I thought is funny. And yeah, I just feel it took some goofy liberties. The ending, where they try to get out of the graveyard, felt lackluster because you find out that one of the ghosts may have done something at the end to basically mess up and take over a character's life, but the other two ghosts basically just F off. They basically just go, "Hey, sorry we bothered you, peace, deuces," and then they just disappear. It's like that felt lackluster. And the whole thing about the main girl leaving behind her brother at the house to try to find Mark at the graveyard, you were just gonna leave the ghost in your house. You didn't think anything about it. She's like, okay, you stay here. I'm gonna go back to the graveyard, and she leaves. And of course, the ghost doesn't stay there. I think he was confused. He's like, did she just leave me behind? Did she just leave me behind in her own house where her parents are at? He was surprised. That's why he followed her, man. It's just some goofy stuff that I thought was a little bit too much. But I give it a 7.2 out of 10. It's decent. It's a fun watch. But again, I wish they would have just made it its own thing. Just call it, Get Out My Grave or something like that. Make it its own thing. And yeah, if this episode was in like Goosebumps, it would be a good one. And I think honestly, this would have made a great Are You Afraid of the Dark episode too. I think Are You Afraid of the Dark could have made something very similar to this, and I probably would have given it like an 8 out of 10, 8.5 out of 10 for Dark standards. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think that going back to what you said about the episode, being goofy. I feel like when you have a 9-page short story that's played up so straight, and you're trying to flesh it out into 20 minutes, there's only so much things you can do with the graveyard before you start becoming like Ghost Beach's book of going A B A B A B. Uh, if they wanted to keep it more like the short story, they could have had the field trip element, but build more onto the field trip and maybe an urban legend about a specific ghost that's in the graveyard, and they're going to be daring each other to trace the grave of a specific ghost. And let's say the girl traces it, which pisses off the ghost. So when the brother comes back later because he left his stuff there, the ghost targets the brother on purpose and gets revenge for her, against her or something. I feel like that could have been like a natural way to do it, but if they're going to keep it linear. But I feel like, especially when you look at season one episodes, when they were looking at the when they were looking at the short stories, they often just said, "Screw it, we're gonna just incorporate it and we're gonna just add on to it." Some of them were faithful. Some of them, like you got Dead Body, where they literally made that whole short story into one scene. It could have been another scenario where they just made kind of like what they did here, the element from them tracing the stuff in the graveyard, literally one part of the story, and then they add on to it like that. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like I'm kind of rambling on now, but I do feel that the episode was fine. You know, it was a fine idea to stretch it out into a 21-minute episode. But like I brought up earlier, I think given the idea we were given in the episode, I would have loved to seen a part two and like them come back to these characters and see and them build onto it, because I think there was a lot of room there to have a sequel. If there's any other episode that could have had a sequel besides Mascot, truthfully, I think Ghostly Stare was a good candidate to build onto, because there's so much added room with the concept, and there's legitimate reason to go back to the graveyard. It's not like it's dumb to go back there. So yeah, I'll just throw that out there. But yeah, let's
And
get into
also,
Sponge. Yeah. You go ahead, Michael.
I was want to add on one more thing quickly as well. Like referencing what you said originally about kind of how like the ending, kind of like the twist ending isn't really a twist because of what you see Lauren falling into the grave beforehand. Like what would be kind of a better ending, I feel like would have been like just end it with her falling into the grave and then having a close up like camera shot zooming in and showing Alice Claiborne's name on the grave. And that's how the episode ends. Like I feel like that would have been a great, more ambiguous kind of way to end it there and made it more a little bit more effective.
Yeah, because then you really don't know what's going to happen to her because daylight struck, but is it exactly the time it needs to be, or is it,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
or is there somebody still lurking on? I think that's a good change too. Um, but yeah, I don't know what else to say. Anybody have anything else they want to add before we get to Spongy?
No, I was gonna say briefly that I think also I think that the story is good. I think that the decision they made for the story is good, but again, it's just like some things about the execution which they are able to do because like if you look at this episode, it's got a dark plot when you think about it. It's a really dark plot, but it's just some of the effects they do, some of the choices they do is goofier. But then you look at an episode like Best Friends Forever, which has one of the stupidest, goofiest plots ever in kids horror, but the practical effects are terrifying. So I feel like sometimes you just gotta take some resources and put it together better. Because if you took the practical effects from like that episode, that type of budget and those type of effects, you put it in this one, but kept the same story, you probably could have got something even better than the short, or not better than the short story, but equally as good as the short story in its own regard. Those are my
You know,
thoughts
it
before
also
we
makes
get
you
to the
wonder if
sponsor.
there was some kind of like studio meddling involved with that. Like they thought the short story would be too dark for the show, and then
Yeah.
they did it, even though they did things like Pumpkinhead, which is arguably darker than the short story. So I
and
don't know.
and again, best friends forever. That type of nightmare fuel practical effects involving a literal dead body zombie of a guy being revived. That stuff they greenlit just because the plot's
Mhm.
goofier. So sometimes it's just the direction.
I feel
But
I feel like Haunting Hours writers probably had way more liberties than Goosebumps writers did.
Mhm.
And maybe this episode can be chalked down to whoever was designed to or picked to adapt the short story was given free reins, and this is the idea they wanted, and they said, "All right, it's good enough, fine." But hindsight can be 20/20 sometimes. BD has a point. I think they could have made the short story into an episode and built onto it.
Mhm.
I even brought up an idea that could work just fine. You just got to build up. You got to build up more of the first act to kind of carry it for like 8 to 10 minutes, and then the second act, releases it. But woulda, coulda, shoulda. This is what they rolled with, and I don't really think it was all that bad, honestly. I think what they did
Mhm.
here was kind of cool, and I think the concept of the falling in the grave stuff would have been a good addition in the short story, and they could have focused on that idea a little more, and that could have increased some stakes there. So yeah, that's just food for thought. But let's see what Spongy has to say, and then we'll get into the comparison.
yeah, so I'll read off his episode review and then I'll just go straight into his comparison and we can talk. So the Ghostly Stare episode, he says, this is an early episode that is one of those season one episodes that feels like a trial run for bigger things they would do later. It tends to be either forgotten about or not liked too much. Not to interrupt him, but I was going to say that Ghostly Stares episode is as invisible as the Ghost Beach book for Goosebumps. So I like that he brought that up. I'd say I like it well enough mostly. I like how it expands on the story to the point of also being a sequel as it goes on from where the story left off. Although I missed the urban legend element the friend brought up, that was cut out of this version. I like the chemistry between the siblings, setting up a mild bit of substance with them. The highlight is the solid atmosphere throughout. There's a decent creepy presence to it, and I like the dark ending, of course. The Alice Claiborne edition is a good idea, and while she can be enjoyable, she doesn't add that much overall. They try to tie her into the brother stuff, but it feels a bit weak, and the resolution is odd and rushed. I like the dark ending, but the way we get to it is goofy. Also, the ghostly effects can be weak at points. Ghostly Stare is the perfect candidate for a story to expand on it, and this easily could have been better, but it fell a bit short. It's mostly good, but the wonky ending pulls it under. It's fine and nothing too bad, but just can't get there. Shame. So those are his thoughts about the episode. And then we
Mm,
can do
Yeah.
Compa- Any thoughts on a reaction to that?
No.
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 So comparison this is a fitting matchup, as besides both having gravestone rubbing, I feel about the same on these generally. Both do most things right, but don't quite excel as those things per se. Very jack of all trade, master of none. Ghostly Stare could have been a full book to flesh things out, but I can be more forgiving on it on a short story level. I don't even know what it could have done per se, even if it doesn't hit as hard as some other short story in these. Ghost Beach, as I said before, doesn't do too much wrong, but doesn't stand out too much. Episode wise, Ghostly Stare wins. It has some flaws, but it has a far more solid, creepy atmosphere and more consistent acting. It's not perfect by any means, but the flaws of Ghost Beach's episode are certainly bigger. Book wise, I'll give it to Ghost Beach. Ghostly Stare's flaws are fine for a short story, so it works decently, but Ghost Beach is able to flesh things out further, so it feels more complete. It could have gone either way. Ghost Beach being a book means it's able to be somewhat more memorable with more going on. It's in the middle as far as these go, but it has enough to be better than a fair amount of middling ones out there. I'm not passionate about it by any means, but yeah, Ghost Beach wins.
So he says Ghost Beach's book is his choice. Yeah. Um, I'm gonna pass over to Micah. Micah, what would you choose?
My pick for the win is the Ghostly Stare short story. Hands down, it's the scariest of all of the group of them. It's precise, it's to the point, it's effective, and I just think it's easily the standout of the group.
All right. BD, what would you choose?
Same with him. Ghostly Stare is pretty much perfect. I like the fact it doesn't overstay its welcome. All the points that we covered, pretty much got it. But if I didn't take that one into account, because that one was basically a landslide victory even before we started reviewing, in my opinion. Just between the three, if the short story was not involved, I'd give it to the Ghost Beach book. So yeah, books are winning on this one, in my opinion.
And I'm definitely gonna give it to Ghostly Stare short story. But I'm honestly more personally, I'm torn between if I like Ghost Beach's book or if I like Ghostly Stairs episode. They're so even to me. I love them both for different reasons. Or I don't love them, but I really enjoy them for different reasons. But if I had to pick, honestly, I'd probably say I like Ghostly Stairs episode more than Ghost Beach's book, just off vibes. And I don't know if it's because of the Goosebumps aesthetic going on, but I can watch it in that charming way. And yeah, I don't get why nobody talks about Ghostly Stare in Ghost Beach's book, y'all. Please go watch the Ghostly Stare episode and read Ghost Beach's book. Can we stop having these books invisible, please? They're not that bad. They're not that worthy of being invisible like Legend of the Lost Legend and Scream School. Keep those books in obscurity, but not these. They don't deserve it. Uh, so, I think it's unfair. It really is. But um, I don't know. Like, Ghost Beach definitely has more strengths in terms of writing. It's definitely more atmospheric. It's played straight. It's darker than Ghostly Stairs episode, but I also think Ghostly Stairs episode is more charming. And I think it still has some brooding atmosphere. It has some fun things about it. And I when I experience kids horror, I'm one of two flavors usually. You got to be bonkers and dark with some creative edge, or you got to be just played straight and pick a lane. Either you're a full on farce and you're smart with it, or you're full on scary and you're smart with it. Ghost Beach wants to be full on scary, but it's not quite there. I feel like Ghost Beach has more things that irritate me than Ghostly Stairs episode. But Ghostly Stairs flaws way heavier, if that makes any sense. But that's where I'm at with it.
I also just wanted to say that when you brought up the point of them being invisible, the fact that the other companions are invisible makes no sense in my opinion at all because like we brought up Ghost Beach's episode is very famous thanks to John Tron and other things, but then the book is invisible. So you're like, why wouldn't people check out the book if they all know about the episode? And then we talked about Ghostly Stare. It's a fan favorite short story in the Nightmare Hour, but then the episode is invisible. So people, go check them out. Give them some attention.
Like, I feel like the reason Ghost Beach's book is kind of less invisible is because like a lot of earlier Goosebumps YouTubers kind of like to crap on the book. So it kind of seemed like to turn a lot of people away from it. Like I remember Zach Baby TV when he was a thing put Ghost Beach as one of like his top 10 worst. So I feel like some of those like those videos like that I think kind of turned some of the audience away from it.
Could be. Go read. Go find out, people. Go read for yourself and come get your own opinion.
Both of these stories, at the end of the day, at least when we're looking at Ghostly Stare short story and Ghost Beach, for the most part, is more throwback horror. It's more gothic horror. If you're not into throwback horror, if you're not into old school stuff, I could see why you might not want to read it. But BD's on the money here. Go check them out. It's old school. It's throwback. It's kind of refreshing, especially for Goosebumps. Go check it out. So yeah, I don't think we have a discussion tonight. I don't think we're gonna do one. But I will say this, I guess we'll make it an on the fly thing here because we already decided our next episode. Why not go ahead and do the JonTron trilogy of Goosebumps for the next two episodes to continue? Since we did Ghost Beach, we already have one planned for next, and we'll do the other one following. So why don't we go ahead and announce our next two episodes in advance for everyone? Because we're not doing a discussion, we'll give you all something extra here. So we decided to do My Harry's Adventure next. And My Harry's Adventure is a puberty allegory story, and it's quite infamous in Goosebumps, kind of controversial, very divisive amongst the fan base. And people have said, like myself, it could have been a DCOM. Well, ironically, there is a DCOM that feels much like it, and we're going to compare My Harry's Adventure up against a classic Disney Channel original movie called The 13th Year, because they're basically puberty allegory stories. One more overt than the other, but they both involve, teenagers turning into, you know, animals, let's just say. And then the one after that, we're going to do Don't Go to Sleep, which is a later original 62 book. And it has a very famous episode because of JonTron. And we're going to face it off against an Are You Afraid of the Dark episode called The Tale of the Wisdom Glass, which ironically stars the main actor who was the main kid in Don't Go to Sleep's episode. So when we cover that one, the kid actor is the lead in both episodes. So it's going to be interesting. So yeah, until next time, let us know down in the comments section if you stay through the whole thing. What would you guys say is better? Do you think Ghost Beach is better? Do you think Ghostly Stare is better? Do you like the episode or the book or short story more? We're dying to know. Please go sub up Micah and BD, aka the Horror Tavern. I'm gonna put their links down in the description and in the comment section of the video, as well as Spongy 444's social media pages as well. Until next time, take care, have a good night, and be well.
Deuces.